but part of the strategic counter-offensive that Stalin had ordered along the whole Eastern Front in December 1941. The Trans-Caucasus Front, with the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla, were in the process of landing over 40,000 men in Crimea. The original Soviet plan was to land 20,000 men of the 51st Army on either side of Kirch, at the eastern end of the peninsula. Meanwhile, 44th Army, with 22,000 men, would land at Feodosia in the west and move north and cut the peninsula at its narrowest point at Parpak. However, bad weather and the need to send reinforcements into Sevastopol made it impossible to launch the attacks together. 51st Army was only able to land about 3,000 men on the 26th of December, and because of the winds and rough seas, it took 5 days to get 20,000 men ashore in a number of small and isolated beachheads. The 46th Infantry Division, the German garrison in the Kirch Peninsula, was beginning to deal with the beachheads in turn when 44th Army started to land at Feodosia on the morning of the 29th of December. The only German troops present were an engineer battalion that had been billeted in the town for the night. As wave upon wave of Russian troops came ashore, the German battalion was soon pushed inland. The defence of the Kirch sector was the responsibility of 42nd Corps, under Lieutenant General Graf von Sponeck. Alarmed by the landings at Feodosia, he ordered 46th Division to pull out of the Kirch Peninsula before it was cut off. Manstein countermanded the order, but von Sponeck's headquarters was already moving back, and radio contact had been broken. 46th Division got clear, but lost most of its transport and heavy equipment in the process, so that when Manstein ordered it to turn about and attack, the division could only manage a show of obedience. Manstein relieved von Sponeck of command, but Hitler insisted on a court-martial. The court, chaired by Goering, sentenced von Sponeck to death. In fact, the situation at Kirch and Feodosia was not as serious as Manstein had feared, largely because the two Soviet armies failed to exploit the opportunities in front of them. Both concentrated on securing the perimeters around their beachheads and made little attempt to expand them. As a result, Manstein was given time to move troops from Sevastopol, although his redeployment was delayed on the night of the 4th and 5th of January when the Russians landed troops at Yevpatoria on the west coast north of Sevastopol. This was a daring blow, accompanied by a parachute landing and an uprising of partisans in the town. However, 11th Army improvised a battle group around 105th Infantry Regiment with some artillery, engineers and Luftwaffe ground troops. Yevpatoria was recaptured after 3 days of fighting. Then a thaw struck, turning the roads back into mud tracks and slowing the eastward move of 30th Corps. By the 14th of January, Manstein had managed to assemble 3 German divisions, plus a Romanian division and 2 Romanian brigades, for an attack on the Feodosia beachhead. The 44th Army had 4 divisions in the beachhead, and there were at least 4 more nearby in Kirch. The Russians had had over 2 weeks to prepare their defences, and if the German attack failed, they might have been left too weak to hold their positions in the eastern Crimea. Nevertheless, Manstein decided to go ahead rather than allow the Russians to bring in more reinforcements. He had obviously come to a low opinion of the opposing Soviet generals, whose defensive mentality suggested that they and their troops were afraid of the German army. On the 15th of January, the attack began. It took 4 days to drive the Russians out of Feodosia. Around 17,000 Soviet troops were killed or captured, but Manstein was disappointed that a large number escaped to the east. He began to prepare to follow up the capture of Feodosia by clearing the Kirch Peninsula. Army Group South promised him more air support, and Panzerabteilung, or tank detachment, with 60 to 75 tanks newly arrived from Germany. This was the first German tank unit to arrive in the Crimea, and the attack was set for dawn on the 26th of January. Then on the 24th, Army Group South called the tanks away to deal with a greater threat in the north. Manstein cancelled the attack immediately and shifted his army to wait on the defensive until the weather improved. The Russians, however, were not yet ready to abandon their hopes of driving 11th Army out of the Crimea. With the Kerch Straits frozen over, it was possible to bring tanks and vehicles, as well as men, across from the Taman Peninsula. Unfortunately, the weather was not reliable, and a series of thaws slowed the build-up of Soviet forces. Even so, by the beginning of February, the Soviet forces in the Crimea, now known as the Crimean Front, consisted of 4 armies. The Coastal Army in Sevastopol, and the 44th, 47th and 51st in the Kerch Peninsula. Together they commanded 17 rifle divisions, 4 mountain divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, and a large number of independent brigades and regiments. They were backed by 5 tank brigades and some smaller tank units. By comparison, 11th Army had only 7 German infantry divisions and 2 Romanian divisions, plus 2 Romanian mountain brigades and a cavalry brigade. The Germans still had no tanks. A Soviet attack was clearly imminent. In fact, Stalin was so impatient that he sent Lev Meklis, the chief commissar of the Red Army, to hurry the preparations. Meklis had taken a leading role in Stalin's purge of the officer corps. No general would dare delay an attack, however ill-prepared, if Meklis was at his side. The Soviet offensive was ordered for the 27th of February. German intelligence knew the date and even dropped leaflets over the Russian front line announcing this. Despite this, Meklis refused to delay, and the Russians attacked as predicted. They were most successful in the north, where 18th Romanian Division was driven back for 5 miles. At the same time, the Coastal Army began a series of attacks from the Sevastopol perimeter. Although at least 35 attacks were launched by the Coastal Army in a week, they were successfully checked by 54th Corps, and Manstein was even able to move another regiment across to Parpak. The fighting on the Parpak sector continued until the 3rd of March, when the Russian attacks were halted, officially because the ground was too soft for the tanks and resupply had become too difficult. But in reality, the Russian tanks were not being used effectively. Middle-ranking and senior officers did not yet have the skills and experience required to coordinate tank and infantry units. However, the weight of Soviet armour opposing 11th Army did convince the German High Command that the newly raised 22nd Panzer Division, with the mobile 28th Light Division, should be sent to the Crimea. The ground began to freeze again on the 8th of March, allowing the Russians to build up their supplies and prepare to renew their offensive. They began on the 13th of March, attacking over the whole front, but concentrating their main effort in the north. Even though the Germans estimated that they had destroyed 200 tanks by the 19th of March, they could not halt the growing salient in the north. Manstein obtained permission to use the 22nd Panzer Division, even though it was still arriving in the Crimea. On the 20th of March, the division attacked, accompanied by the 46th and 170th Infantry Divisions. It ran into a Russian assembly area, and the attack backfired. Operating with the Corps headquarters and flanking divisions that it had never trained with, 22nd Panzer had an uncomfortable baptism of fire. But Manstein felt that the arrival of German tanks would severely limit Soviet operations. New offensives were launched on the 26th of March and the